welcome to Berea in northern Greece. Today, this is a small city of about 100,000 people, but back in the first century when Paul visited this place, it was known as Berea, and it was one of the most important and influential cities in the region of Macedonia. And I'm standing here in front of the shrine to the Apostle Paul. And what's interesting to me is that this shrine is even here in this city, because I'm not so sure that Berea was part of Paul's original travel plans. You see, he had been preaching the message of the crucified and resurrected Jesus in the nearby city of Thessalonica, and many were responding and placing their faith in Christ and becoming followers. But some of Paul's adversaries, they had formed a mob and stirred up a riot in the marketplace. And this was so concerning to the new believers in Thessalonica that they waited until nightfall and then smuggled Paul and Silas out of the city and sent them about 50 miles to the southwest to, well, here in Berea. And so what's going to happen here in this city? In Philippi, it was a beating and a night in jail, and in Thessalonica, it was a riot and a narrow escape. Is Paul going to experience some of the same difficult opposition here in this city? And if so, how do you continue to move forward in the face of such fierce resistance? And this is a question for Paul in his journey, but also a question for us in ours. And so let's jump in and discover what happened here in Berea. And along the way, I hope that we, along with the Apostle Paul, find strength for the journey.
All right, how we doing? Good to see all of you. So glad that you're here today, and I want to welcome those of you joining us from our campuses, and also those of you who are watching online through Ada Bible Church online. Just thanks so much for tuning in. My name's Aaron, if we haven't met, Director of Student Ministries here, one of the teaching pastors, and just so privileged to open the scriptures with you today as we continue part 4 of this fall series, Strength for the Journey. And I want to begin our time today by telling you about the last time that I snuck out of the house. It was last week. No, just kidding. I was a freshman in high school, if I remember correctly, and the deal was some friends of mine, we decided that we needed to TP our teacher's house. That's what we were going to do, and so I had a bunch of them over for the night, and we stayed up late, but then went to sleep, and right a little bit after midnight, we snuck out of my bedroom window. And we'd, of course, purchased and hidden all the necessary supplies. We got that. We went over to this teacher's house. And I mean, when we were finished, it was like Christmas morning. It was so white, okay? We just absolutely crushed this place. And then we completed the mission, headed back through the bedroom, went to sleep, nailed it. Woke up in the morning, went to breakfast, sitting there eating my cereal, and my mom says, so what'd you guys do last night? Played Mario Kart. Really? Where'd you guys go? To sleep? Guess who cleaned up all that toilet paper? This guy, yeah. What is it with moms? How do they always know? You know what happened is she had painted recently my bedroom windowsill, and apparently footprints on the window, so whatever you're planning, middle school and high school students, just understand your mom will know. I don't know how, but it's just something, a superpower that moms have. So the reason I tell you this story is the Apostle Paul, who's like the main character in our series, Strength for the Journey, he's actually pretty good at sneaking out. He does this on more than one occasion, and we find him sneaking out at the beginning of our story today. Actually, I have a painting of a situation here. This is like soon after Paul became a follower of Jesus. This is in the city of Damascus, where he ran into some trouble, because the deal was everywhere that he went, he was bringing the message of Jesus, and he experienced a lot of opposition, resistance, sometimes even violence, and so it was a pretty normal deal for Paul to be sneaking out of town under the cover of darkness. And I look at this, I see, okay, ropes in a basket, no footprints on the windowsill. This is a good idea. So anyway, where we pick up the story, Paul is sneaking out of town. But maybe you haven't been around. Let's catch up a little bit on this series. Here's the table of contents of the New Testament, the second half of our Bible. All these stories from Strength for the Journey, they come from the book of Acts. And the way the New Testament is set up, these first 4 books are the Gospels. They are the historical accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. And then this is like the sequel. This is a story of Jesus, his disciples, what they did, and how the early church began. And so just an interesting side note, Luke is also the author of Acts. And so if you're new to the Bible and like, where should I start reading? That's a really interesting place to start because Luke wrote an account of Jesus' life and then also the story of the disciples. Now, Strength for the Journey, this is all about one of Paul's missionary journeys, what we call his second missionary journey. So here's a map. The journey actually began in Antioch in Syria and then on through Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. You may notice it seems like every other town is named Antioch. It's just kind of the way it is. And then after some confusion, God leads Paul and his companions across the Aegean Sea over into what we would call Greece, but back in the day was the Roman province of Macedonia. And in our series, we've been following Paul in Philippi, where he was beaten up, thrown in prison, and then headed out of town after a bunch of people came to faith. And then Thessalonica, similar story. Some people received the message of Jesus, but some Jews who were really opposed to what Paul was doing, they stir up a mob, and there's a riot. And then here is the text from the book of Acts where we'll begin today. As soon as it was night, and we're in Thessalonica here, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Now here's a map showing where Berea's at. So Thessalonica, Berea, 50-ish miles. And keep in mind, this is a journey on foot. You know, for us, it's like 50 miles. What is that? Less than an hour in a car? No, this is like a 2 or 3 day walk for Paul and his companions. And so this place here, Berea, is where our story takes place. And we're going to be talking about something unique that happened in Berea. And actually, the uniqueness, as Luke, the guy who traveled with Paul and recorded the history that we have in the book of Acts, he tells us it was actually the people of Berea that were unique. He describes them as having they were people of noble character. There's something about these people that really impressed Paul and his companions. Just something about them really stuck out to these guys. And you might be thinking, well, what was it? Well, that's the subject of our conversation today, this character of the Bereans. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at their character, and anytime that you do that, it's going to cause us to reflect on our own character. And I got to tell you, just spending some time with this story, it's going to be a challenging conversation because it's going to force us to look at our lives, how we make decisions, how we speak, how we live. And we're going to be looking at the example of the Bereans, and I think we're going to find this to be very challenging. But let me tell you, we need this today. The character of the Bereans, we need this. As we seek to live our lives, and many of us attempt to follow Jesus in our culture, and it's challenging. And so this is going to be a challenging and encouraging conversation for us today. And I don't know where you're at today. I don't know if you're somebody that's kind of exploring faith in Jesus, or somebody that's growing in your faith in Jesus, or maybe wandering even from your faith in Jesus. But wherever you're at, I think there's going to be something good, something challenging for you here today. So just to let you know where we're headed, it's going to be 2 noble characteristics. That's what we're going to be looking at. And then just one short response that we're going to be talking about. So 2 noble characteristics and a response. So let's jump into the story here and check out this first noble characteristic. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away from Thessalonica, remember, to Berea. And on arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now, this is something that Paul, always did, and it makes a lot of sense. He always goes to the synagogue because he was ethnically Jewish. And so these are his people. He relates really well to them. But not only that, he was trained, big time trained in the Jewish scriptures. He studied under a famous rabbi. Paul was a Pharisee. I mean, he really knew his stuff when it came to the Jewish faith, the Jewish scriptures. And so it makes a lot of sense that this is typically where he starts his ministry in a new city. Now, here's a picture of the synagogue in Berea. We had the opportunity to visit this place. There's only one in the entire city. And so here's the outside, now here's the inside. And supposedly this is the oldest synagogue in Greece. And supposedly this synagogue sits on the site of the ancient synagogue that Paul visited. Now, I don't know that there's any way to actually verify that, but we do know that Paul visited a synagogue that probably looks something like this, and he began to teach the Jews there. Now, what Paul was doing is he was bringing a message. He was bringing a message to these Jews, and you gotta understand, this was a difficult message for the Jews to accept. This message of Jesus, the risen and resurrected Messiah. It was difficult for the Jews to accept, and here's why. This is what a first century Jew believed. This is kind of an oversimplification, but the general idea. And Pastor Jeff kind of drew this out earlier in the series, so this may look familiar, but a first century Jew believed that people could have a relationship with God, they could be made right with God through the law, through what God had revealed in what we would call the Old Testament, what the Jews would call the Jewish scriptures. And by law, I mean the whole idea of the temple being where God dwelled, the idea that sacrifices, animal sacrifices, is how you forgive, how you receive forgiveness for your sins and were made right with God, that all these different purity laws is how you maintained right relationship with God. You had a relationship with God through the law. This is what Jews kind of had always believed. And now here comes Paul with this message who's saying, look, the life of Jesus and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, this changes everything. And so he kind of says, look, Jesus supersedes the law. And the law finds its fulfillment in Jesus. And this is the message that Paul is bringing. So if you're a Jewish person in that synagogue, it's kind of like, okay, time out. Let me get this straight. What you're saying is that everything that we've believed for like 1,000 years, and everything that we've practiced for all of our lives, you're telling us that this Jesus changes everything. And that in this Jesus, God is moving us in a new direction. And Paul's like, yeah, that's right, you got it. And so do you understand how some of these Jewish people were very resistant to this teaching? Because Paul's asking them to change everything. It's like, no, God's moving in a whole new direction here. And everything that you grew up with and that you've taught and everything that's familiar, like, yeah, you kind of don't need it anymore in some ways. And maybe that's kind of how you feel if you're somebody that's exploring faith. This idea that's like, okay, if Jesus is real and if Jesus is who he says he is, then this changes everything about my life. So maybe you can relate. And so this is the message that Paul is bringing to the Jews. But Luke tells us that the Jews in Berea, they were different. They had noble character. So what was it about them that so impressed Paul and his companions? Well, look. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, the Jews that stirred up a mob and ran Paul out of town. For they, here it is, received the message with great eagerness. As Paul's teaching this message about the risen and resurrected Messiah, Jesus, they're actually listening. They're like, no, hold on, let me write that down. Or, well, hold on, can I ask a question about that? They're receiving it. They're attentive. They're listening to the message. You might say, and this is the first noble characteristic, that they're open to God. And what I mean by this is that they are open to the possibility that God might be moving. And they're open to the idea that maybe God does want to move us in a new direction. They are open to God's movement and direction in their lives. And Luke says this is noble. This is noble character. So they were open to God. Question for you, are you open to God? Are you open to God's movement in your life? To the idea that he might want to move you in a different direction than you're currently heading? Are you open to God? Now, I don't know about you, but I find this to be more than a little challenging. Because I'm good with God's movement in my life until he starts messing with stuff that I kind of care about. Until he starts messing with my routine, my free time, the way I spend my money. And then it's like, whoa, easy, hey. And the reason is I'm pretty comfortable with how I spend my time and my routines and how I spend my money. I'm comfortable in that space. And I don't know about you, but I kind of like being comfortable. You might say I'm actually very comfortable with being comfortable. But something that I'm learning is that being too comfortable can make me resistant to God's movement in my life. It can make me resistant to God's new direction in my life. I guess what I'm saying is, if you desire to be open to God's movement and direction in your life, then just don't get too comfortable. Don't get too comfortable in your understanding. Because God might want to reveal to you, you got a little bit more to learn about that. Actually, you know what? You're wrong about that. Don't get too comfortable in your understanding. Don't get too comfortable with your routines. Because God might just want to disrupt your routines and take you in a new direction. Don't get too comfortable with your character. Well, that's just the way I am. That's just the thing I do. When I talk, I'm just one of those people that doesn't have much of a filter. This is just who I am. Don't get too comfortable there, because I can imagine that God might want to grow you, might want to mature you in some of those areas. Don't get too comfortable with your stuff. Things you own, your home, your money. God might have a new direction for you. Don't get too comfortable with your plans. Well, I'm gonna go to school here, and then I'm gonna go into this field. Or, I'm gonna work in this company for the rest of my life. Don't get too comfortable. I got two close friends who were accepted into medical school, plan to be doctors, and they're now pastors. Different direction. And I have friends who went to school to be a pastor who are now doing great work helping people in real estate. Don't get too comfortable. God might want to move you in a different direction. When I was in college, I attended this church where the pastor, before every sermon, prayed almost the same exact prayer every week. And he would pray for two different groups of people in the congregation. He would pray for people that needed to be comforted. I think because he knew that every week people show up that are going through difficult things. And so he would pray that God would bring comfort to those who needed comforting. That's the first group of people that he prayed for. Second group, he prayed for people that needed to get more uncomfortable. He would say something like, there's a bunch of us here that are just way too comfortable, and God, would you shake us up and make us open to what you might want to do? And I just wonder if some of us need to start praying that prayer a little bit more. Because if we're going to be open to God's movement and direction in our lives, being too comfortable will make you resistant to what God desires to do. In fact, being too comfortable can be an enemy of God's movement in our lives, in God's direction in our lives. And so being too comfortable can be an enemy to God's movement in our lives. But I think there's another enemy as well. And that enemy is confusion. And what I mean by this is when you find yourself in that place where you're asking, okay, is God leading me this direction, or is it this direction? Am I supposed to do this, or is it that? Is it A or is it B? It's when we get confused about whether or not we should or shouldn't be doing something, or whether God is leading us or not. So let me ask you a question. How do you make decisions in your life? Like, how do you decide what's best, what's right for you? How do you make those decisions? How do you go about it? Like, let's say you're watching Netflix. And you know how Netflix works, where they suggest what you should watch? It's like, oh, you like this show, you should watch this one. How do you decide whether it's a good idea for you to watch that show or not? How do you decide what's best and what's right for you in your life? You know, in a little over a year, there's going to be an election in this country. And I've heard there's some controversy about the presidential election. How do you, thank you for that delayed laugh. Yeah. That joke might not work as well as I thought it would. Okay. Politics. How do you make decisions? In about a year, you're gonna have to make a decision about who you're gonna vote for. How are you gonna make that decision? How do you decide what's best and what's right in your life? Let's say you've been dating somebody for a little over a year, and it's going really well, like really well. And he invites you to move in with him. It's like, take the relationship to the next level. How do you make that decision? How do you decide what's best and what's right? Or maybe it's a different scenario. You've been married for a little over 10 years, and it's really not going well. And truth is, you're incredibly unhappy. And there's a big part of you that just wants to walk. How do you make that decision? How do you decide what's going to be best, what's going to be right for you? Or think about the many tensions that we experience in our culture. One of the most complex conversations in our culture today centers around the LGBT plus community. How do you make decisions here? How do you decide what you believe, what you think, what to say, what not to say? How do you make decisions in your life? So this traveling preacher shows up in Berea and starts an interesting conversation in the synagogue about this man named Jesus and how his life, his death, and his resurrection change everything. And how God is now moving in a new direction. And these Jewish people in Berea listening to Paul, they have noble character. And so they're open to the idea that maybe God is moving in a new direction. But this is a big deal. This is a massive change. And so how do they make a decision about this Jesus? Well, let's look. Back to Acts 17. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and, here we go, examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. They examined the scriptures. It's kind of like, hey, Paul, listen, this is a very interesting conversation. And this story that you're telling us about Jesus being the Messiah, this is fascinating. And let me tell you, compelling arguments that you're making. But if you'll excuse us, we're gonna go check this out for ourselves. We're gonna examine the scriptures for ourselves to see if what you're saying is accurate. You see, the Berean Jews used the scriptures as their starting place to determine whether or not something was true. They were viewing everything else through the lens of their Bible. You see, they were anchored in the Bible. This is the second characteristic we want to talk about today, is that they were not only open to God's movement, not only open to the idea that God might be taking them in a new direction, which is important, but they were second noble characteristic, they were anchored in the Bible. That's how they made their decisions. I mean, if you were to go to the Berean Jews, if you had a time machine, and ask them, hey, how do you make decisions about life? How do you go about making decisions? I think they would say, well, we start with the Bible and ask the question, what has God already said about that? You know, what has God already said about, and that's exactly what they were doing. Paul was saying, look, Jesus is the Messiah. And they were like, well, hold on. Let's go look at what God has already said about the Jewish Messiah. And I think they would do the same thing with any of the questions that we have in our lives. What has God already said about politics? And what has God already said about sexuality and sexual boundaries? What has God already said about relationships? Any of the questions that we have, any of the tensions that we experience, what has God already said about that? And they would use that as their starting place in making decisions because they were anchored in the scriptures. And they might put it a different way too. Check this out. This is from the text we've been looking at. They examine the scriptures every day to see if what, and I took out Paul and put in a blank, to see if what Paul said was true. Now, I just think that we can put whatever we want in there, and it works. They examine the scriptures every day to see if what their friends said was true. They examine the scriptures every day to see if what the news said was true. They examine the scriptures every day to see if what the internet, put in whatever you want, Oprah, whatever you want, put whatever Aaron Buer said was true, which I think is important. Don't just take what I say for fact up here. Like, you should examine the scriptures. We should all be anchoring ourselves in the Bible. And this is what the Bereans did. And Luke records for us, hey, this is noble character, that they're open to God's movement and they're anchored in the scriptures. So they were anchored. Question, are you anchored? The questions that you're wrestling with right now, the decisions that you have to make in your life, the cultural tensions that we encounter every day, are you starting with, now hold on, what has God already said about that? And let's examine the scriptures to see if what fill in the blank is true. Are you anchored in the scriptures? Now, as I think about this, I think there are really two challenges we have to talk about here. Two challenges that often keep us from truly being anchored in the scriptures. And the first challenge is just this word right here, authority. Because when it comes to questions that we have, decisions that we're making, tensions that we're attempting to wrestle with, we already know what God has said about that. We already know. And we're either ignoring it or rationalizing what God has said. I find myself doing this at times. I've been in plenty of conversations with friends who say, I know God has said, X, Y, Z, but I just think in my case or our case, or I just think that God's okay with it. And we ignore what God has already said and we rationalize it. And I just need to challenge that thinking for a second. Because to ignore and to rationalize is the same thing as to reject. Rationalizing and ignoring is the same thing as rejecting God's authority in our lives. And that keeps us from being anchored to the scriptures. And some of us, I think, just need to wrestle with that and just maybe admit, I think I'm rationalizing that. Or, you know what, I've been ignoring that. I just don't want to deal with it. This issue of authority can keep us from being anchored. And there's a second challenge, and the word here is understanding. And the deal is, for some of us, when you ask the question, okay, what has God already said about that? And the answer is, I actually don't know. Or, I've heard somebody say, but I never actually read it for myself. And it's just, there's a lack of knowledge. There's a lack of understanding. And that can keep us from being truly anchored to the Bible. When we don't actually, you can't be anchored to what you don't know. And so what do we do here? How do we grow in understanding? How do we grow in knowledge. Well, let me share with you our church's strategy for growing in this area. And if you've been around Ada for a while, this will be like old news. And if you're new, this will hopefully be really helpful. So this is our strategy. It's called the row, circle, and the chair. And you'll notice first off that there are puzzle pieces. They all fit together. They're all important. But in each one of these environments, what we're doing or what we hope to do is examine the scriptures and over and in different ways ask the question, what has God said about that? So that we can understand how we are supposed to live as followers of Jesus. Now, the row is what we're experiencing right now. I don't know if you knew this, but many of you are sitting in a row. So there you go. We're in the row. And we're examining the scriptures together. We're opening the scriptures and I'm teaching. And this is so essential. It's so important, and it's a great place to start. But I'm telling you, if you want to be anchored in the Bible, you also need the circle. And the circle is all about relationships and community. In for us, it's small groups. It's being in a community and exploring the scriptures together. And let me tell you why the circle is so important. Because if while I'm teaching, you raise your hand with a question, I am not going to call on you. I'm sorry, I know it's rude, but this is not the right environment. We don't have time, sir. You can put your hand down. I'm not gonna answer your question here. But the truth is, we have questions and we have doubts that really need to be talked about. And so we need spaces where we can engage those. And the circle is that space where we can journey together with other Jesus followers, other people who are exploring faith, and ask the questions, hey, I don't know that I understand that. Or, I'm not sure I even believe that. Or, if that is true, then I'm gonna have to change some things in my life, and I am gonna need some help there. The circle is where we can unpack these questions, and it's so important. And something that's so great, so cool about what's happening in our church right now is last weekend, we did this event called Group Launch at all of our campus, and in like 42 groups were formed or reformed. I'm talking like 400 people joined a circle last week. And that's just like couples groups and singles groups. That doesn't include those of you who are involved in women's ministry or men's ministry or Lifeline or Union. I think it does include Union, actually. But what I'm saying is so many of you are jumping into circles, and that is so great, and it's going to help you get anchored in the Bible. And if you're like, shoot, I missed the boat, listen, digital bulletin, adabible.info, go there right now, join a group, send an email. I won't be mad that you're not paying attention for the next 30 seconds. Be a part of a group. This is essential. This is so important. But if you want to be anchored in the Bible, you got to have the chair as well. And this is our image to describe that personal time with God, that one-on-one time with God in his Bible, listening to him, praying to him, conversation. And let me just show you a detail that we've kind of skipped over so far in this story that we've been looking at. They received the message with eagerness, and they examined the scriptures, and here we go, every day to see if what Paul said was true. They're examining the scriptures every day. It's not a flyby. It's not a one-time. It's like over and over and over they're getting into scripture. This is so important, and this is what we do in the chair. Now, back to the row circle chair image. Something that I just got to be honest with you about is in this space, I can't anchor you. Jeff Mannion can't even anchor you because it's like 30, 40 minutes a weekend. It's not enough. If you want to be anchored, you got to have the circle, and you've got to have the chair. And if you're interested in taking the next step in this area and becoming more anchored in the Bible, there's a lot of options. Here's a great one, a resource that we put together. And like I said, the whole picture is like a puzzle, because what we talk about in this space in the row is what we'll talk about in the circle, and then it's what we'll talk about also in the chair through the Beyond the Weekend resource. And so sign up for this, 5 daily devotionals that you can use throughout the week. And something cool about this week is that on Thursday, the team will be unpacking some tips, some pro tips, if you will, on how to read the Bible, how to study the Bible on your own, which is exactly what you need to do to anchor yourself in the Bible. This is so important. And just one final thought on this idea. The series is called Strength for the Journey. And we're all on a journey. We're all going through things, good, bad, ugly. And I gotta tell you, personally, number one source of strength in my journey is anchoring myself in the Bible, in what I get directly from God in reading the scripture. Number one source of strength for the journey. And so if you're in a tough spot, if this is a difficult journey, I'm telling you, this is more important than ever for us to anchor ourselves in the Bible. So what happened in Berea? What were the results of their openness to God and the fact that they were examining the scriptures? Let's check it out. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. People are coming to faith. A church is being formed. Let me just say this. If you're exploring faith, if you're unsure about Jesus, I triple dog dare you to open your heart and read the scriptures. Maybe Luke and Acts. I just believe that God's going to reveal himself to you. And those of us who are already Jesus followers, if you do these things, you're going to grow. I mean, you're going to grow. It's just how it works. And so I'm thinking, man, finally for Paul, something's going right. Philippi, he got beat up, thrown in stocks, a night in prison. Thessalonica, he gets run out of town because there's a riot. And now finally he arrives in Berea and people are responding and it's finally peaceful and things are going well for Paul. For a minute, for just a hot minute. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. They're trying to stir up another riot. Understand, these particular Jews in Thessalonica are so against, so opposed to what Paul is doing. They're willing to walk for a couple of days to stir up trouble for him. What strong, passionate resistance. And I mean, if you're Paul, at what point are you just like, all right, enough. This is too tough. I'm sick of getting beat up, sick of prison, sick of riots, sick of these people chasing me town to town. And at what point do you just go, you know what, let's pack it up and let's go back? At what point do you give up? Because it's too tough. But Paul doesn't give up. He doesn't quit. He keeps moving forward. And what's interesting is that our story today, the strength that he finds for his journey comes from the response of the Bereans. The way that the Bereans respond is what gives Paul, I think, the strength to keep moving. Let me show you what I mean. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast. But Silas and Timothy, these are Paul's companions, like fellow workers, they stayed at Berea. And those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens. And that's where we're going to be next week, by the way. And then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. Now, I have no way to validate this, but I just imagine this scene where this brand new Jesus community is gathered together in somebody's house. And it's like, listen, those Jews from Thessalonica, they're here. They're in town. They're stirring up trouble. They want to hurt Paul. And so we got to get Paul out of town. And so we need somebody who can keep Paul safe, that can get him to the coast. And then somebody, brand new believer, goes, I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll get him out of town. I'll keep him safe. And Silas and Timothy are like, we're staying. Yeah, sure, it might get ugly. Sure, it might get violent, but we're staying. And we're going to continue to teach, and we're going to continue to equip because we want this church to grow and to thrive. And then it's like, okay, Paul, he needs to get down to Athens, and he's going to need to take a ship. And so that's going to cost money. And somebody goes, I got that. I'll pay for that. Okay, but that trip to Athens, I mean, look at this map. That trip to Athens is long. It's like 300 miles. Somebody is going to need to journey with Paul, and I mean, you're going to be away for at least a month, maybe longer. And a couple people are like, we'll go. It's fine. We can leave our families. We can leave our work. We'll go. We want to be with Paul. and you see these brand new believers. I mean, as I read the story, it's like they've been Christians for like 5 minutes, and they're ready to serve. They're ready to jump in. This is the response. 2 characteristics and a response. The response of the Bereans is they're ready to serve. They're brand new. They don't know all the stuff. They don't know the whole story. They haven't even heard all the Jesus content yet, and they're ready to serve. They're ready to jump in and help. Some of them stay and serve, some of them go and serve, but they're ready to serve. And this is like a theme in these missionary journeys. You may remember this story in Philippi, where this wealthy businesswoman, Lydia, who sells purple cloth, she comes to believe, she gets baptized, and it's like immediately she's like, all right, now the church is gonna start meeting in my house. She's ready to serve. Happens over and over and over again because this is the model of Jesus, who left heaven and became a servant. And Paul took up that theme. He begins almost every single one of his letters. Paul, servant of Christ, or sometimes slave of Christ. Servanthood, this idea of being ready to serve, it's critical, it's core to what it means to be a Jesus follower. And I believe it's part of what made the early church so compelling and so resilient. The way that they loved and served each other, and the way that they loved and served those who were not yet part of their Jesus community. It was just like, oh, now what is up with these people? And why? Maybe there is something to this Jesus. That's the way that it was. That's the way that it was so powerful. And so they were ready to serve. The question for you, are you ready to serve? Because Paul and his companions needed new believers who were ready to serve, to keep going. And that brand new church in Berea needed people who were ready to serve so they could grow and get stronger. And Ada Bible Church needs people who are ready to serve if we're going to accomplish our mission and be the kind of community that Jesus is calling us to be. So are you ready to serve? Here in the walls of our church and outside in our community, are you ready to serve? Let me give you one specific need that we have right now. And this is like a really good challenge. You're probably familiar with our children's ministry. It's called Discovery Village. Hundreds and hundreds of kids are a part of Discovery Village every weekend at all of our campuses. It's an amazing ministry where kids get connected with other kids, and they're connected with an adult who cares about them, and they get to experience the message of Jesus. I mean, this is how we pass on faith to the next generation in our church. It's so important. But here's what's happening at some of our campuses right now, is that families are showing up, bringing their kids to Discovery Village, and they're getting turned away because there's not a spot for their kid. And it's not because we don't have enough classrooms. It's because we don't have enough volunteers. And I don't know about you, but I'm just not okay with that. That our kids are missing out on this incredible opportunity to get connected with people and hear the message of Jesus. I'm just not okay with that. So here's an example of a real need that we have in our church, and I'm asking, are you ready to serve? And I just hope that some of you, like that circle of Jesus followers in Berea, would just say, yeah, I'm in for that. I'm ready to do that. Because we need each other, and we need people that are ready to serve. And maybe kids is not your thing, I get that. But we have a lot of other opportunities. And I'm telling you, I long to be the kind of church that when somebody who is outside of faith or it's been a long time walks in the doors of our church, they experience something that they don't get anywhere else because of the kindness, because of the love, because of the way that we serve each other, that it would just be like so evident that it's like, whoa, something's going on here. And I long to be the kind of church that when we go outside of these walls, to our neighborhoods, our schools, and our workplaces, and the organizations and ministries that we serve in the city, that people would go, now what's up with that? And there's just something different about the way that we serve, and it's because of Jesus. I long to be that kind of church. And so, are you ready to serve? Listen, as we wrap up, there is an opportunity that you and I have this week. because Paul found strength for his journey. And this time it wasn't because of his strong character and fortitude. And it wasn't because of some message that he received from God, but it was because new believers were ready to serve. And their service gave him strength for his journey. And you and I are going to have an opportunity this week, and I don't know what it's going to be, but I bet you're going to get it, where we can provide strength to somebody else's journey with the words that we say, in the way that we serve them, in the way that we help them. And maybe in your near future, it's strength for a kid's journey in our children's ministry. But let's be the kind of people who are ready to serve so that we can give strength to others in the journey that they're on. I'd love to pray for you as we close, and then I want to invite our campus pastors and room hosts up to say a few final words and then dismiss us. God, we're just grateful for this time. Grateful for the character of the Bereans that we got to look at today. God, I just confess, I want to be more like the Bereans. And I think a lot of us are feeling that right now. God, I just want to be open to what you're doing in my life and not resistant because I'm too comfortable. And God, I want to be anchored in your Bible, not making decisions based on how I feel or the influence of others, but I want to decide because of what you have said, God, and that takes courage, that takes humility. God, meet us in that space. Give us the encouragement that we need. Some of us are going to walk out these doors today and have a tough decision to make. Would you give us what we need? And God, would you shape us to be a church that serves and reflects you? God, that's what we desire. God, we pray all this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus. Amen.